Can you hear it? Welcome to Relay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Relay Space. This week, get us off this rock. I'm going to start with a space-related quote-y thing because I have decided I feel like it. To place a man in a multi-stage rocket and project him into the controlling gravitational field of the moon where the passengers can make scientific observations, perhaps land alive, and then return to Earth, all that constitutes a wild dream worthy of Jules Verne. That was said by Lee DeForest, who was born in 1873, and he was an American inventor. And yeah, I felt that it kind of fit because today we're going to be sort of following up from where we ended last week. We've slightly modified our lesson plan. We're going to touch more on ways of getting off Earth this week. And then next week, we're going to be starting into the survival in outer space. But before we hop into that, because it's humorous, you'll see a nice image up there talking about Space Force. This is apparently from ABC.
But not American ABC. This is from Australian ABC. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
If you look really closely at that picture, some of you might notice something. Do you think they got a freelancer to take this picture for them?
A freelancer taking a picture of a freelancer? I don't know.
So
Fastcar, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC. But yes, apparently the Space Force is now using freelancers.
Yep. Confirmed. Heard it here first.
Okay. That concerns me somewhat because, for multiple reasons.
Yeah.
All right.
So,
okay.
Quickly, what did we cover last week?
We covered the history of SpaceX basically up to present. So right from the founding of SpaceX through the Falcon, the trials and tribulations of the Falcon 1 and the rise of the Falcon 9. Sort of culminating in the recent launch of Falcon Heavy. That's quite the expression on your face there.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get right into this week. We're going to start with a little bit of a status update on where SpaceX is right now. Take it away, Nakara.
All right. So SpaceX to date has performed a total of 66 flights. 5 of those launches were Falcon 1, of which 2 were successful. The last 2. There have been 60 flights of Falcon 9, which I'm sure surprises some people. It doesn't quite feel like 60 at this point. 59 of those were successful. Amos 6 was not considered a launch incident because it happened during a testing. So it was a test incident. This puts their flight rate at 98.3% and their mission rate at 96.1% because you include the one where they had Amos 6 incident. There's also been 1 successful flight of Falcon Heavy. In 2017, they had 18 flights. That was their best year to date. These were all Falcon 9 flights, and they were all successful. In 2018, we've had 15 flights to date, so we should end up with about 24 by the end of the year. And one of the things that has been noted recently is that Gwynne Shotwell, who is the president of SpaceX, mentioned that 2019 could be somewhat of a slower year. They've SpaceX relies fairly heavily on the geostationary satellite market. And in 2017, there were very few orders for geostationary satellites. And geostationary satellites generally it's 2 years after they're ordered that they get launched. So 2019 is probably going to have probably around 20 launches total for Falcon 9, then maybe a couple for Falcon Heavy.
As we're in 2018 right now, do we have any idea if the orders for this year are higher, so we can expect to see more launches in 2020, or is that something we still have no information on?
Last time I'd heard, they were up a little bit. But like not to the levels they were in 2016, for example.
Right. Now, and this is for all companies or just SpaceX?
All companies. Like worldwide, geostationary satellite orders were way down.
Right.
And the reason for this is there's a couple things converging here. Mostly geostationary satellites are useful for TV.
Wait,
TVs...
Does TV still exist?
Yes, it does.
Oh, okay.
That's part of the problem. These satellites are very expensive, on the order of $200 to $300 million to build, and then however much it costs them to launch them. And they have lifespans of like 20 to 25 years. Well, what do you project the TV market's going to be like in 20 years?
Wait,
yeah.
Does TV still exist?
Exactly. So they've been kind of scaling back their efforts on that front, especially sort of looking at what seems to be the rising age of smaller satellites in lower Earth orbit, creating these constellations like Starlink that SpaceX wants to launch. But so far this year, there have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 awards, which is significantly better because last year there were only 10. And we're only a little over halfway through this year, so that is significantly better. Now, one of the problems for they don't have. Sorry, I was just looking at this. They don't have launch contracts awarded. Looks like it's doing better this year, but last year sucked, so 2019 is going to be pretty slow. Anyway.
Now, there's another question there, actually. If these geostationary satellites are, things that are looking 10, 15 years in the future for cost effectiveness over their lifetime, and if this is one of the main ways companies like SpaceX get their funding, is there any risk of SpaceX funding drying up a little bit in the next 5 years as people stop launching TV satellites because is TV even a thing anymore?
No, not really, because it just switches to other types of, like, those companies that run these gigantic telecommunications networks aren't going to just go away. They will just shift their operations to something else, right? So they'll launch smaller satellites, maybe in low Earth orbit or medium Earth orbit, or even just smaller, cheaper satellites to geostationary orbit, where they can, so they don't have to spend as much money up front on them, then maybe even have a shorter lifespan satellite. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It won't dry up. It'll just change. And then we're sort of in that inflection point when it's changing. And sometimes you get these huge drops in orders like you had last year.
Right.
And plus, SpaceX has a lot of other business. Actually, something to note right off the bat, they have, I believe, on their manifest, they now have like around 100 missions worth about $14 billion. So they have enough work for a long time.
Excellent.
Oh, and the other thing you might see in 2019 is so I did mention you'll probably see 2 Falcon Heavy launches. You'll also probably see some tests of the Big Falcon spaceship, which is the
It
first
is
stage
not
of
called the Big
second-
Falcon.
Okay.
It's the big.
Are we allowed
fucking
to?
rocket.
Are we allowed to swear on this place? Wait.
It's the big
No.
fucking rocket.
It's the big fucking spaceship. So you'll see some tests, some hop tests of BFS probably next year. And you might see some test missions or very, very, very operational missions for Starlink as well.
Cool.
Now, so continuing the sort of stats to date, Falcon 9 first stages have attempted 31 landings so far on either a drone ship or a landing pad. 26 of these 31 landings have been successful. All 9 attempts on land have been successful, and 17 of 22 on the drone ships have been successful. But most notably, the last 14 in a row on drone ships have been successful.
That actually
Now,
seems like a lot higher number than I was expecting. Like I seem to remember a lot of crashes and then the success and then not really hearing about it much after that. So
Unless you were talking to me.
well, yeah. I mean, okay, no. Clarification. I heard about it, but I heard about it through you.
Yeah. So I just wanted to clarify. I was specifically talking about Falcon 9 there. So then Falcon Heavy's inaugural launch saw beautiful tandem landings on land for both side boosters. However, the center core missed the drone ship due to a failure to relight 2 of its 3 engines when it was trying to perform its landing burn. This is specifically because the rocket ran out of a material called TTEB, which is triethyl aluminum and triethyl borane. Basically, they're two liquids when combined instantly ignite. So it works as a really good way to ignite an engine. But they ran out of it when they were trying to land that center core, and so it crashed instead of landing. And just to sum up, the first and only flight of Falcon Heavy to date was successful. Falcon Heavy will begin operational missions in the first half of 2019 and has 5 contracts total thus far. 2 of which are expected to fly next year. Very notably, very, very importantly, Falcon Heavy won its first Defense Department contract, or Air Force contract, sorry. That was huge. Getting Air Force certification that fast is very impressive. Now, the most important thing that's happening right now, commercial crew program. So this is the crew access arm for the commercial crew program. This is at pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center. And this is how the astronauts will get aboard the Crew Dragon spaceship. As you might note, the arm looks quite pretty, but the tower looks kind of old and dirty and drab and gray. Elon did confirm on Twitter the other day that they do plan to put cladding up on the tower, which will enclose the tower.
They're going to make it look pretty.
And yeah, they're going to make it look pretty. I've also heard that this kind of has an operational use as well. Apparently, the levels on that tower get extremely dirty, and it can make maintaining it very, very difficult.
I'd imagine when a rocket takes off, there's probably a lot of stuff that hits that.
Yeah.
I do want to. I mean, we'll talk about the crew and the Dragon a little bit more soon, but I'm not. So neither of us here are American, but even I have a slight bit of real anticipation for people to be launched. For manned launches to happen again on American soil, because
Yeah.
It's been a long time.
And I'm sure the astronauts are quite tired of the busted ass Soyuz.
Yeah.
It works really, really, really reliably and really well. It's not a comfortable vehicle to be in. It's not comfortable to launch in. It's not comfortable to be in, and it's not comfortable to land in at all. A lot of those astronauts have described the landings on Soyuz as like getting into a car accident at the end of being in space for months.
Already being weak and then hitting the ground at like...
It's like 12 miles an hour, so it's a decent jolt. Just bam into the ground.
And you might think, oh, well, car accidents happen a lot at much higher speeds, right? Like a 12-mile-an-hour car accident is not terribly bad.
Nothing. Yeah.
But keep in mind, you're not hitting a car. You're hitting the ground.
You're hitting
the ground doesn't move. It don't give a shit.
Be like hitting a wall at 12 miles an hour. It's not comfortable.
Okay.
Anyway, regardless, so I just wanted to mention right away. Can you just put up the picture of the Crew Dragon?
Yes, I can.
Right here. So this is Crew Dragon. You can't quite see here. On almost none of the pictures can you see it, but I think this is so cool. The solar panel design on here. The solar panels are out right now. Can you see them? I didn't think so. Is the trunk that's attached to the bottom of the spacecraft. About half of it, the half that will point towards the sun, is covered in little solar panels.
Nice.
And so they don't have to have any fancy deployment mechanism or anything.
It just
solar panels. Is there. Yeah. And so I think that's super cool. So I actually wanted to mention that because what is happening right now? Well, the spacecraft part, the top of it, Crew Dragon, is at Kennedy Space Center right now for the first uncrewed demo flight. The trunk is actually in Hawthorne at the SpaceX factory getting the solar panels put on right now. And then the rocket that will launch this guy in November is currently very close to completion in Hawthorne as well.
And it's not going to be a manned launch, right? It's going to
the
be
first one will not. No.
Yeah.
So this basically what's going to happen is this capsule will be launched in November. It's completely autonomous, so it will carry some supplies and maybe some other things to the space station, and it will dock autonomously with the space station. And basically that will prove that the vehicle can go from launch all the way to the space station and dock. Then in March, they'll do what's called the in-flight abort. And what this does is it proves that at any point during the flight, the capsule can abort away from an exploding rocket and the people who are inside would be fine. That test, which is not mandatory, this is an optional thing that SpaceX is doing. That test will be March 2019. And it will be this same capsule that does the first mission. They'll refurbish it in like 4 months and then launch it again for the in-flight abort. And then a new capsule will fly with crew in April of next year.
Nice.
And that will be the first crewed mission to the International Space Station since 2011 from the US.
In April.
Yep.
That's going to be something to watch.
Now, there is some risk on the schedule there. NASA's still trying to figure out. There's a chance that they might turn it into a full operational mission, which would mean that instead of Dragon staying at the station for 2 weeks, it would stay there for 6 months instead.
Okay.
And this is all down to what NASA views as the best way to manage their schedule for their astronauts. If they turn it into an operational mission, it will probably slide into the summer because they'll have to line it up with how their crew rotation goes, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a ongoing thing, but it will happen. Like it's all proceeding quite well. It'll happen soon.
Cool.
So that's crew. That's the commercial crew program. It is extremely important for SpaceX. No commercial company has ever launched humans into space. Period. Sorry. Into orbit.
Yes.
Because Spaceship One did it in 2004.
But that was space. And what technically...
That was suborbital. Yeah.
What is technically space is not really space, let's be honest.
No, you're talking about a difference of you basically get 4 minutes of weightlessness versus weeks or
yeah.
So we're gonna move on from here to the big fucking rocket. There, is that better?
That is much better.
So, what is the BFR? What's the BFR? The BFR is basically the best way to put this is that
it's a big fucking
BFR.
Rocket.
It's a big fucking rocket. Yeah, it is SpaceX's solution for how the hell do we get to Mars. And unlike a lot of the previous sort of iterations on this one might be a little closer to reality than you might think, and we'll talk about that a little later.
It is huge.
The BFR is 348 feet tall. It is 28 feet in diameter.
That's at least 3 of me tall.
No.
At least
it's at least 30 of you tall. At least.
Fine.
At least. That makes it 51% taller than the Falcon 9 and 150% larger in diameter.
It's stupid big.
31 engines on the first stage of the BFR and 7 engines on the second stage. Now, there's something important to point out here. The second stage is not really a traditional rocket second stage. The second stage of BFR is a spaceship, as in like classic science fiction. It is a spaceship. Because it is a spaceship, not just a second stage of a rocket, it has 4 vacuum engines and 3 sea-level engines. Now, why would it have 3 sea-level engines if it is flying through space?
Mars.
And Earth.
It
has to land again. Normally, we don't land the second stages of anything, really. Any rockets. But, of course, this will be carrying humans and cargo to and from Mars and the Moon. And so it has 3 sea-level engines. Now, you can kind of look at this quite convincingly as their approach to reliability here. They only need 1 sea-level engine to land it, but they have 3. The reason they have 3 is right down to just pure and simple reliability. And sorry, not reliability, redundancy. Basically, they're saying they can survive 2 engines going out on a landing. That is kind of incredible.
I mean, if you're going to get people in it, you kind of want it to be able to survive. Couple
exactly.
Engines going out, right? So,
and that's also like the 31 engines on the stage. It could probably survive half a dozen of those engines going out. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That is also the case with Falcon Heavy, by the way. It could survive 6 engines going out. Now, recently they lowered the payload capacity for BFR slightly. Their now rated payload capacity is more than 100 tons. It used to be 150 tons. Now, the reason for this is that, again, it's actually down to reliability. They had planned to push the Raptor engine, which is going to be the engine for the BFR. First time, by the way, since Falcon 1 that they'll be moving away from the Merlin engine. They decided to opt for a chamber pressure for Raptor of 250 bar rather than 300 bar. By the way, both of these are incredible. So a bar is atmospheric pressure. So you're talking about 250 versus 300 atmospheres of pressure. inside the combustion chamber. They opted for 250 because it's safer than going directly to 300. They will always, or they will eventually get to 300, but they're going to start at 250. But that lowered the payload capacity somewhat of the first BFR. So let's move along to this tank because I wanted to talk about it.
Also huge.
Yeah, so this is not a BFR.
This one is black.
It sure is. This is not a BFR tank. This was the tank that they originally designed for what was called the ITS. The ITS was called the Interplanetary Transport System, and it was basically a previous version of BFR that was even larger, but they decided to scale it back because they found that a vehicle of the size of BFR would be much more reasonable to build. But one of the things they did right away when they were talking about the ITS was make this fuel tank. Now, they go, well, why did they make a fuel tank so freaking early in the process? The reason is that carbon fiber and liquid oxygen have a very interesting relationship. They tend not to get along particularly well. And so SpaceX had some ideas on how to fix this, but they had to test it really early on because the whole design hinged on whether or not these tanks would actually work. And so they built this tank very early on, and they actually tested it all the way to failure. They got it to 2.3 atmospheres, which is well above where the pressure they need it at, and then it failed. And they basically just kept increasing the pressure until it exploded, and it flew about 300 feet in the air and then landed in the ocean.
Right.
This was by design, by the way. But Paul Wooster, who's the principal Mars development engineer for SpaceX, recently mentioned that they have now completely solved the liquid oxygen and composite problem. Now, this is important because with a ship that big, with a vehicle that huge, weight becomes really important. The more you can get the vehicle weight down, the more payload you can get to orbit. And so they opted for a completely carbon fiber vehicle, including the tanks. So let's move along to the Raptor engine.
Fire.
Yeah. So this was, the text is about a year old. So at that point, they had 1,200 seconds of firing the Raptor engine across 42 main engine tests. Tests lasting as long as 100 seconds, which was how much fuel they could put into their test stand. At that point, it operated at up to 200 atmospheres. But that was a year ago. They have now basically reached almost the end of development. Word is that they're getting ready for production on the engine. And the very important thing about this engine and the rocket is that it's not a kerosene and liquid oxygen rocket like Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy. This is a methane rocket. Now, may very well ask, why the hell would you want a methane?
Why would you want a methane rocket?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, really, it comes down to what can you make on Mars? Well, there's two different rocket fuels you can make on Mars. One is hydrogen, and the other one is methane. Hydrogen's a great rocket fuel. Works really well. It sucks to deal with. As many people know from pictures and videos and maybe even some real life encounters,
It's
things like the Hindenburg have happened.
Yeah.
It's extremely volatile. It's very hard to handle. It tends to like to catch on fire and explode with very little provocation. And the other biggest problem with hydrogen is that it's not very dense. This leads to you having to create an extremely large rocket in order to have a hydrogen rocket. One good example of this is that, and you'll see this later, but the Delta IV Heavy, which is a hydrogen rocket from ULA, is almost exactly the same physical size as Falcon Heavy, which is a kerosene rocket, and the Falcon Heavy has twice the payload capacity. Anyway, that is the Raptor engine, and it will power the BFR and the BFS. So let's move on to probably the most important part of the rocket architecture,
which of course is
refueling.
not showing up. Give me a moment.
Oh, great.
Give me a moment.
What is its problem?
I don't
Hey, no problem
know.
at all. So, one of the problems with huge rockets and spaceships is that, okay, well, great, you got it to orbit. The problem is, launching from the ground, you actually can't get it very far, no matter how big it is, because the spaceship is just so heavy. The solution to this is on-orbit refueling. And they're going to be designing the BFR and the BFF for this operation right from the very beginning. So they will fly a BFS up into space, into low Earth orbit, and then they'll launch another one up to refuel it. And how many flights they need to refuel it, because they actually can't carry enough to refuel it completely. How many flights it takes to refuel it will depend on how much payload it's actually launching. The maximum number they think is 4 to 5, and that's for max payload to the surface of Mars. All right.
I wanted to make a crude joke, but I'm not going to.
Really?
Moon Base Alpha, yeah. I
So
refrained.
SpaceX is not super focused on the moon, but if NASA goes there, SpaceX is more than happy to help them with their plans. And they're going to be one of the best equipped to help them with their plans. So they basically just floated this out there. We can easily help you, build a moon base if you want, with BFS.
I mean, if they have to refuel the BFS 4 times to get to Mars, it would probably only require one refueling to get to the moon. Yeah. Easy.
So what they can do is they can they actually talked about this during the presentation, but they can launch it into an elliptical orbit, which has a really high apogee, so high point, and then refuel it once while it's in this elliptical orbit, and then it can go all the way to the surface of the moon, drop off its cargo, and then fly all the way home without having to be refueled.
It's phenomenal.
Yep. And keep in mind, because these spaceships are looking at, being able to be reused up to 1,000 times, launching it, having to launch to refuel it is not really a big deal for SpaceX. It's all it really costs them is fuel. It's not like, trying to launch a Delta IV Heavy to refuel another Delta IV Heavy.
And you lose...
Delta IV Heavy's $450 million or $400 million of flight.
Yeah.
The SpaceX plans for its marginal cost, so the amount it will cost it to launch just again, if you know what I mean, is only going to be about $5 million, they figure, which is not really a drop in a bucket for a company like that. And if they were running a moon mission for NASA, it would probably be quite the big contract. So
yeah.
Anyway, let's move along to the most important goal for SpaceX.
Mars.
These goals here were published last September at the International Astronautical Congress when Elon Musk talked to everybody about what he wants to do. And he said when he put this slide up, that's not a typo. Those are the actual dates that they're planning on. Very interestingly, Paul Oster, as I talked about before, gave a talk only last week for the Mars Society. These dates are unchanged at this point. That's another year down, and they're still aiming for 2022 for the first cargo missions to Mars with the BFR architecture. Now, in the SpaceX community, the fans mostly believe that they're probably going to have to slip at least once. But if you aim for 2022 and hit 2024, that would be considered a huge win by the spaceflight community.
You're still getting to Mars
with a huge amount of payload in not very long. Yeah, it would be a huge win if they could pull it off. Now, what are they going to do at Mars at the beginning? Well, as you can see on here, they're going to confirm the water resources and the hazards of their landing site, because where they land is actually where they want to build a base and then eventually a colony. So they want to know what's there. And if everything checks out, they're going to place power, mining, and life support infrastructure for future flights. Keep in mind, they can do that because those initial... you're talking about each of these spacecraft can carry 100 tons to the surface of Mars. An enormous amount of payload. So they can carry mining equipment, power generation equipment, life supporting equipment, no problem. And then in 2024, they plan to do 2 cargo missions and 2 crew missions. So this was sort of the animation of just basically a concept of what the base buildup might be like. Now, this is somewhat unlikely to actually be realistic, but they just wanted to give an idea of what they would love to have happen. One of the reasons this is somewhat not realistic is radiation. Is a decent chance that most of the first Mars base will be underground.
I mean, this is completely realistic. It just wouldn't have looked as pretty if it was all underground and you just saw the surface of Mars. Really, all of this is going to be in tunnels dug by boring machines from the Boring Company.
Except for the solar panels.
Which is also interesting because you know what else the Boring Company makes? Flamethrowers. Elon Musk knows that there are arachnids on Mars, and he is preparing his troops to fight off the arachnid invasion. You heard it here first.
Totally, yeah. 100%. So this last picture is my favorite one. It is absolutely fantastic. They adapted an old picture from Curiosity, I believe, of sunset on Mars. And you can see it's actually kind of a neat thing. Sunset's blue on Mars, whereas on Earth, sunset is red and
/ pink
yeah, and the middle of the day is blue. But I thought that was kind of cool. But I love this picture. It shows basically a fairly early base on Mars. You can see there's 4 BFS spacecraft on the ground there.
And they have cars there that'll be running on electricity provided by solar panels.
And nuclear.
And nuclear. 100%. Oh, nuclear.
As you may have heard recently, Mars just had a 3-month-long dust storm.
They did.
So I think now more than ever, they're looking for multiple ways of generating power. Also, actually, on that note, very important study that's been done recently. They're quite certain that you could actually, because of the lower gravity, you could use wind power on Mars. So that is actually a huge addition as well. Now, what are we looking at here, David?
This is a video of the BFR from Earth to Earth.
Why would
and
you
the
want
music's
to do that?
Fantastic.
I'm sure it is. Now, SpaceX is going, well, if we're going to have this like hugely reusable spacecraft anyway, well, what else can we use it for? Well, the truth is, they would love to use it to transport people very, very quickly from place to place. They could get pretty much anywhere in under an hour from anywhere else. And most places they could get to within half an hour. There are many people who don't believe this is realistic. There are many people who believe it will never happen. Gwynne Shotwell, who is the president of SpaceX, is adamant that they are going to do this, that it will happen. And that they not only will it happen, but that it will happen within 10 years. And that was a year ago that she said that. So,
I'd much rather take a 30-minute rocket trip to Austin than a 7-hour plane flight, personally.
That's fair. That's fair. Actually, that is a good note, too. One of the things that they mentioned with BFR, one of the ways they're going to fund creating that huge rocket is that BFR and BFS will replace all of the functions of their current rocket. So Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy will be slowly replaced by the BFR system. And so all of their design and engineering effort, everything will go into the BFR. Very possibly Fast Cart. So, remember how I said earlier that this is not just a fantasy rocket? That's because of this picture. And one other picture I will show shortly. But this picture is what's called... I'm going to wait for David to come back. Where's David? Who knows? He left. This picture is of what's called a mandrel. It is the tooling for creating the main hull of the BFR and the BFS. So this is 9 meters in diameter, which is, of course, the diameter of the rocket. And basically the way that you create the rocket on this is you wind the carbon fiber composite over the surface of the aluminum mandrel.
Sorry about that.
Hello.
Hello.
And so, yeah, they kind of shocked everyone with showing off this tooling for the BFS about 6 months ago. And then we had this picture. Now, Teslarati has started doing space coverage as of last year, and they have some amazing reporters and photographers. This one's from Pauline Acklin in Los Angeles. But she managed to sneak over to that tent that you saw and got this picture inside months after that previous picture was taken. Now, the important thing to note here is that the mandrel is on a different stand. This stand, as you can see, is an operational stand. It actually, you can see the rollers on it. You can see power running to it. This is actually what you would use to turn the mandrel while you're winding the carbon fiber on it. What that basically means is they could be testing the production of the first Big Falcon spaceship right now. And keep in mind, even that, like that picture was taken months ago as well.
We've got another good payload capacity.
Yeah, except this one's now a little bit inaccurate, but that's okay. So, as you can see, very high payload capacity for BFR. We don't know what its final payload capacity will be. It might be similar to what the Saturn V is. It's probably not going to be the 150 tons, at least not right away. Keep in mind, Falcon 9 has basically doubled its payload capacity from when it was first flying. So it's likely that it will increase in the future.
Sorry, I'm just trying to make it a little larger so you can see all of the rockets on there. But those are mostly...
Exactly.
I mean, aside from, I think, the Saturn, those are mostly recent rockets, right? And the Soyuz.
Well, the Soyuz still flies, though.
Yeah.
Actually, all of those rockets are currently flying except for Saturn V.
Which is interesting because, I mean, the Saturn V was to get to
The moon.
and after that, once they didn't need to go to the moon anymore,
They stopped making big
they
rockets.
yeah.
Well, the biggest problem with a big rocket is that it gets more and more and more expensive, and you throw it away every time, right?
Yeah.
Well, what if basically SpaceX just asked the question, well, what if you didn't throw it away?
Why are we throwing away a $400 million rocket when we could just
Exactly.
land it? We can land stuff on other planetoids. We can land stuff on Mars. Why can't we land it back on Earth?
Exactly.
Okay.
So, all right. Where are
Let me
we?
grab this. We are
Oh, yes. Ha 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 ha.
Ah.
So you might we need more information about how to pay for this thing. Well, that's how you pay for it right there. Look at that. Thing of beauty, hey? That, folks, is Starlink. Actually, that's not Starlink.
It's not, but it's
It's a very similar idea to Starlink, except Starlink will also cover the poles.
yeah.
Um,
It was hard to find an actual image of Starlink. I was having trouble, but this is the idea. The idea is all those dots you see there are all tiny satellites, essentially.
Exactly. Just a moment here. I think I saw one the other day. Just a moment. I think I can find it again.
Sure. The idea is that initially they'll have something like around 4,425 satellites.
Yeah. Okay, I
there-
found it.
Oh, you found it. Okay.
Can you play this video for me?
I probably can. Let me
There we
grab
go.
this.
Is Discord okay?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Let me.
All right.
Let's see if this works. Da-da-da-da. Okay.
So this is a visualization of the Starlink constellation. And yeah, this would be basically the 4,425 satellites. Now, what is Starlink? Well, Starlink is going to be an internet constellation. So its role will be to provide worldwide high-speed internet anywhere in the world. Not only high speed, low latency. One of the biggest problems with satellite internet is that it's provided from geostationary orbit, which is 36,000 kilometers away.
That's far.
So Starlink will be provided from 1,000 kilometers away, and will eventually possibly be even provided from 500 kilometers away, depending on whether it gets approved. But this basically means you can get latencies down into the range of like 25 milliseconds, which is fast enough to play any real modern games. And they're planning for their connections to be about a gigabit. Now, whether or not they can achieve it is a question, but that is the initial plan. Now, so we mentioned 4,425 satellites. Well, that takes a long time to launch. There are only 1,400 satellites in orbit, period, right now. Oh, sorry, operational satellites in orbit. Well, according to their license, SpaceX will have to launch 2,213 of these satellites by March 29th of 2024, and will have to launch the entire initial constellation of 4,425 satellites by March 29th, 2027. They can begin, SpaceX actually mentioned recently, they can begin operations once they have 800 satellites up, so they can start connecting customers. And then, after the initial constellation, they have another constellation of an additional 7,000 satellites planned for a total of 12,000. Now, these guys right here are called Tintin A and Tintin B. They were the first two Oh, sorry, this is just one of them, but there is another one attached on the other side. This was one of the first Starlink test satellites that was sent up earlier this year. Their mission was a complete success, and they will be sending up a new iteration of test satellites next year before beginning actual production and deployment of the operational constellation.
Now, how many of these can they deploy on one flight?
The best we've figured is that on one flight you can launch 25 on a Falcon 9. Now, most people believe that the initial constellation will be started by Falcon 9, but probably finished by BFR, because BFR can launch 300 at a time, as opposed to 25. Now and it's actually kind of interesting because when you're in the Falcon 9 stage, your main limiter is launch rate, right? Because you have to launch. Like, honestly, if you look at how fast they have to launch, you'd have to launch once a week,
which they can do.
To launch. What they can do, but that's even pushing SpaceX's boundaries on their abilities. Keep in mind, we're talking. Remember, their most flights ever will be this year. It'll be like 24, not 52.
Close. It's half.
And then, half, yeah. And not only that, but then you have to add all their other operational missions on top. Yeah. So probably flight rate will be their major limiter for a while. But once BFR becomes operational, their major limiter will be how fast they can make satellites, because BFR can launch them 300 at a time. You know? Now, why would they even do...
Are there any worries of having like 12,000 satellites flying around?
Absolutely. They're being pretty heavily regulated on this. They have to have a very, very, very comprehensive plan for how to deorbit these satellites. They have to be very maneuverable so they can avoid debris. So, because honestly, the biggest risk for them creating debris is them getting hit by debris that's already up there. So they're making them very maneuverable so they can dodge around if they have to.
Have they considered making them with a sticky coating so that other debris just sticks to them?
That would be amazing. But usually when you get hit by something in space, it's going about 20,000 kilometers an hour.
Really big sticky coating.
Like 40 feet thick.
Yeah.
No, they have not considered that. Now, I could go into huge depth on what the constellation will look like, but suffice it to say, the plan is to provide internet to the whole planet, period, regardless of where you are. You will need a ground station. The ground station will be about the size of, it'll be an antenna about the size of a laptop. They're working to get these stations down to as cheap as they possibly can, to the point where they actually recently basically threw up their hands because they'd talked to so many companies about trying to get them built cheaply, and they hadn't had any success. So it looks like they're going to make them themselves, as SpaceX does almost constantly. Their big thing was they wanted to make sure the terminal could be under $200 US, because otherwise it's really hard to get enough
people
to buy them. And a lot of industry experts were like, well, that type of a ground station is at least $1,000. Well, it's not that useful.
Yeah.
Now, why would they do this at all? Well, there's a couple big reasons. First of all, the internet industry on Earth is not only enormous, but it's getting bigger fast. I've seen some fairly reasonable calculations that once the initial constellation is operational, that they could generate something on the order of $60 billion a year in revenue from these satellites. That's insane.
Also, it would really help if internet wasn't transmitted on giant underwater cables.
Yes, it would.
Because those realistically, those get eaten by sharks all the time.
No, they don't.
Damn it! You're crushing
Those
my
cables,
dreams, man.
those cables are like 6 feet thick, or even bigger. They're enormous. I'm sorry I crushed your dreams, though.
Crushing my dreams.
But actually, that is one of the reasons why Google invested the biggest investment anyone has ever invested in SpaceX, which is $1 billion, and it was earmarked for Well, most people believe it was earmarked for Starlink. Now, that basically is because they want to move the backbone of the internet off the planet into these satellites so that they constantly are sending information back and forth from each other and pre-positioning data, which already happens on the ground, for customers.
Long story short, what this means is when this is successful, people in Australia might not have 1700 ping.
Exactly. And importantly, we can go to Mars.
Well, I mean, that's a side thing. The main one is
$60 billion a year in revenue would give SpaceX enough money to go to Mars.
Yeah.
Period.
A couple times.
Now, I just wanted to talk shortly about the long-term future. So we're going to just run through a quick series of images here. It's very likely the ITS will eventually be built by SpaceX. It is enormously, gigantically huge, but they probably will build it eventually. These were pictures from its original presentation, and it's things that SpaceX would love to do. They believe ITS would be able to visit anywhere in the solar system. And I think you'll eventually see them fly this vehicle. It might not look exactly the same. In fact, it very likely won't. But they will go through iterations and build up bigger and bigger vehicles over time. And you'll eventually get to see things like this.
The idea of seeing us land like in our lives, theoretically, watching us land a ship on, I don't even know, and Enceladus or just anywhere is, oh yeah. So
I know,
yeah,
and it's Enceladus, but I'll let it pass.
it's a difficult one to pronounce, and I don't know why it was the first one that came to my mind. I'm sorry.
So what we just wanted to talk about here at the end is we just wanted to quickly run through, well, SpaceX is planning all these big things, but surely they must have people who are trying to stop them or doing their own thing or trying to win this business away from them. So we're going to run through other ways to get to orbit. How else can you get to orbit? So some of these are SpaceX competitors. Some of them are silly. We're going to run through them all. This one is, we're just going to choose one image out of this, but China has a very successful space program that's becoming a lot more successful. They had some rough starts in the past, I don't know, 10 years or so, but they're getting to be very reliable. They have flown more times this year than the United States has as a whole. I think they've flown 23 missions already this year. Now, this rocket in particular is a very interesting design that a lot of people are kind of wondering about. This is the Long March 8 that they're planning to build. It is, as you can see, a reusable rocket. It will land on landing legs with grid fins. Now, really weird thing, it has 2 side boosters, but they will stay attached to the rocket. Very interesting design. It should be interesting to see how that works out. China does have they can offer pretty good launch prices, but even they're having some troubles competing with SpaceX. But the big boundary, the big problem for China is they're not allowed to launch U.S. U.S. Payloads. So we're going to move on to Japan. So I'm just going to talk about Japan. And actually, the next three countries I'm just going to talk about briefly. Japan has a pretty successful space program. They don't launch a lot, but they have very good success. Their current rocket is called the H-2A. It's sort of a medium launch vehicle. It's smaller than Falcon 9. They're moving on shortly to the H-3 rocket, which will drive down their launch costs. You'll notice this is a very common theme. The H-3 is looking to try and get down somewhere close to SpaceX, but again, it's a expendable rocket, and it's still projected to be more than Falcon 9. India has been really pushing their space program recently. They've been coming along quite well. They recently announced that they're going to be looking towards human spaceflight in the early 2020s. India's rocket program is pretty good, but they've had problems with high payload mass. They are not getting very high payload mass from their rockets, but they are fairly successful. So definitely a contender there. Their launch prices are very low, and definitely competitive with SpaceX. Their reliability record and their launch mass are their sort of problems at this point. Now, Russia has been a big player in the launch market for a very long time, since before the United States was. Russia is not doing particularly well at this point. They have basically decided to cede the commercial launch market to SpaceX and Arianespace. They appear to not be trying to build they're retiring their Proton rocket, which was their quite cheap rocket that was competitive with the Falcon 9, but after a series of failures became dangerous to fly. But basically they seem to be retreating from the commercial market entirely. They do very, very good underlying hardware for their space program, so we might see some more things from them in the future. Arianespace, by far the biggest government-backed competitor for SpaceX. Arianespace is a private company, but they have the backing of the ESA, which is the European Space Agency, and they're basically public-private partnership. They're closely related to the European Union. This is the Ariane 5, a very powerful launch vehicle. Honestly, this launch vehicle is it is more powerful than the Falcon 9 specifically to geostationary orbit. And that is because they actually do kind of a unique thing in the launch market right now. They do a lot of what's called dual manifesting, where they'll actually launch two gigantic geostationary satellites together inside on one launch. It takes a lot of payload mass to be able to pull that off, and they do. That is a hydrogen-fueled rocket with two solid rocket boosters on the side, and very, very capable vehicle. However, that Ariane 5 you're looking at right there is probably $200 million.
Doesn't really compete.
Not really, but then we have the Ariane 6. The Ariane 6 basically is a spiritual successor to the Ariane 5. It reuses a lot of the same designs. And this is sort of what you'll see a lot from Arianespace. The Ariane 4 was very closely related to the Ariane 5, which is closely related to the Ariane 6. They've managed to achieve some significant savings, though. They do expect to be able to fly the Ariane 6 for, looks like about $100 million, roughly. And if they're dual manifesting, that would put it at only $50 million per satellite, which would be competitive with SpaceX, but possibly only just because SpaceX announced at the Falcon Heavy launch that their cost for, or their price for reflown or previously flown rockets was $50 million. Ariane 6 is not flying yet. It will be flying in 2020 or 2019 or 2020. Notably, they have all new solid rocket boosters, and kind of a cool thing. One of those solid rocket boosters of the either 2 or 4 you see there forms the basis for the new Vega C launch vehicle. So basically, their other launch vehicle is just one of those solid rocket boosters with a satellite on top. Now, for the real competition, Blue Origin. Let's all watch. Keep in mind, the 2 months ago thing, this took place in 2016.
That's enough of that.
So this guy, this is the New Shepard rocket. And you might go, well, that's a really little rocket. Well, it is a really little. That's because it is a suborbital booster. And it is not really, it will carry payload sometimes, especially experiments, but really what it's for is to carry people. This will be a space tourism vehicle, and it's looking like by far the best option for space tourism. Also, the entire vehicle is reusable, as you can see. The New Shepard capsule will be able to carry 6 people into space, which is above the Kármán line, and then bring them back down safely. Basically, half of the like with all of the amazing Star Citizen pilots out there that always want their cockpits to just be giant bubbles. Well, about 50% of the New Shepard's visible area is windows, and that's basically to maximize that viewing experience for the 6 passengers that are in it. They plan to start flying tourists next year. It's looking very much like that will be the case. They're doing very well. They plan to fly their first crewed flights, which would be their own pilots, or their own people, I should say, by the end of the year. So we'll have to watch for that. Now, obviously, you're like, well, that doesn't compete with SpaceX. SpaceX doesn't do that. But developing that technology led to this.
I think this might be computer graphics.
Are you sure?
Maybe.
Looks totally realistic, man. What are you talking about? So what is this? This is the New Glenn rocket. It might not be completely obvious, but that is a very large launch vehicle. Not as big as BFR, but almost as powerful as Falcon Heavy in a single stick rocket. So this will be a very competitive launch vehicle. One of the kind of things that makes it a little mysterious is we have no idea what the price of this vehicle is at all. There have been no leaks, no rumors, and nothing.
It does look like they're trying to exactly do what SpaceX does.
Yep. Except with a bigger single stick rocket.
Yeah.
The only problem I have, and this is just a personal problem, and I hope it doesn't come back to bite them in the ass. You are not allowed to operate a ship autonomously yet. So they plan to land on a ship. Keep in mind, SpaceX lands on a barge.
Yeah.
Barges are allowed to be unmanned. Ships are not allowed to be unmanned. They plan to land on a ship while the ship is underway, so while it's moving. And unless they can change maritime law, they have to have it crewed, which means there have to be people on board. And as you saw from all of the giant explosions that SpaceX had, there are some concerns here.
Just a few.
They also have no plans to land back at the Cape.
My biggest problem with that rocket, I really
What?
don't like the grid fins that move on it that
Oh, the little, yeah, I know. Me too.
that look to me like they'll be under such force that they'll just snap off but yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people are wondering how well they're going to do. They're going directly from a very, very small rocket to a very, very big rocket.
Though it is important to note that Blue Origin is funded by Jeff Bezos, who is basically the richest person
In the world.
in the world.
Yeah.
They've got the money to do anything, really.
Yeah, I want to play this out for you, right? So, not only is he the funder, he's also the founder. In order to allow Blue Origin to operate mostly in secret for the first decade or so of their existence, he bought 165,000 acres in West Texas, which is where Blue Origin is headquartered. In the middle of nowhere in Texas, on a ranch that is 165,000 acres. So yeah,
So that's a lot.
that's a stupid amount. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, it is important to note most space startups that go, that don't succeed run out of money. Blue Origin will not run out of money.
Yeah.
Ever. They have an infinite supply of money. They will eventually be successful. Now, one of the things to note, though, is they are not, while they are a competitor with SpaceX, they're not really a direct competitor completely, because they have almost no interest in Mars whatsoever. Blue Origin's focus is on what's called cislunar space, so that's between the Earth and the Moon. They want to move, eventually their big goal is to move heavy industry off of the Earth into orbit, and to
Start mining out the moon.
and to build large bases and colonies on the moon. But the New Glenn rocket will definitely take some of Falcon 9's business. Very capable rocket. They are also planning on doing dual manifesting. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that goes. Also of note, New Glenn is also a methane rocket up there with BFR. All right, so we have a few more to talk about here. The other competitor you probably have absolutely have heard of, United Launch Alliance, with the Atlas V. Well, we're going to start with the Atlas V. So the Atlas V is probably one of the most respected rockets in the business today. It has never really had a failure. It had one sort of pseudo failure at the very beginning, but it has flown something like 75 missions successfully. Very, very reliable rocket. NASA loves this rocket. Launches a lot of NASA science missions. As you can see, it has a whole crap ton of different configurations depending on how much you want to send. And generally, a very good launch vehicle. But there's one huge problem with it. It runs on Russian rocket engines. That's right, folks. RD-180s built in Russia. And the U.S. passed a law a few years ago that says that they are not allowed to use that engine anymore. So, Atlas V is nearing the end of its lifespan. So we're going to move on to the Delta IV Heavy. The Delta IV Heavy is very well respected as well. Was the king of the rockets until Falcon Heavy came along. Has extremely high payload capacity. Recently launched the Parker Solar Probe on one of the highest energy missions ever. Very, very impressive rocket. A beast to watch launch. This is as I mentioned before, it is a hydrogen rocket. And so you get this really interesting effect. See how it's all scorched up the sides like that? Well, the hydrogen leaks out a little bit before the flight, and you always get this really scary show when it launches where it looks like the rocket is burning alive on the pad. There's just huge flames shooting up the sides of it, and then it takes off. Anyway, the Delta IV Heavy is reaching the end of its life as well. It is an extremely expensive rocket in around $400 million. And that is just not useful for long term. I think they'll be operating for about another 6 or 7 years. Now, well, what is ULA going to do if they don't have their other two rockets? Well, they're going to do this one. This is called the Vulcan rocket. And yes, it has the stars and stripes pattern. I think that's a little ostentatious, but all right. So there'll be two major versions of the Vulcan rocket. The first one looks a lot like an Atlas V, the one on the left. So this will be brain was misfiring there for a moment. One of the interesting aspects of this rocket, and by far the most controversial aspect of it, is that it doesn't have an engine yet. It is supposed to fly.
I've heard that engines are important.
They are very important.
Okay, just check.
Their plan is not to make engines because they're ULA. Their plan is to buy engines. But they're in this pitched political battle where they would like to buy the BE-4 engine from Blue Origin that will fly on the New Glenn rocket. But there's a lot of political interest in propping up a company called Aerojet Rocketdyne that has been around forever. And they're using their AR-1 engine. And we are now about 18 months into a battle over which engine will power this rocket. So
a political battle?
Yes.
Because I know of something else that politics has fucked with.
What's that?
Well, it's the next rocket on our list.
Oh, yes, that one. Well, we'll get to that in just a moment.
Yeah, we'll get to that. And it's just...
So I need to touch on one thing here, because I'm not going to totally shit on the Vulcan rocket for one reason. Tory Bruno is the CEO of ULA right now. He's actually a really cool guy. Trying his absolute best to turn this gigantic immovable object that is his organization into a competitor in the modern launch market. And they're actually doing something really cool, and it's called ACES. And that is on the right. So the Centaur on the left is the old upper stage. It's just going to be reused. The same upper stage that's used on Atlas V has been used on many, many rockets going back for like 20 years. Now, ACES is a brand new upper stage, and it's really interesting. It is called the Advanced Cryogenic Evolved Stage. Well, what makes it interesting? Now, what makes it interesting is that upper stages have a big problem where they tend to operate on batteries, and they run as long as they can, but then they run out of power and they can't run anymore. They're like, well, how do you fix that problem? Because if you could have an upper stage that could run indefinitely in orbit, you could do stuff with it, like tow things around, move things back and forth between the Earth and the Moon, all sorts of cool things. Well, they actually took a clue from a pretty common technology on the ground. They're going to put an internal combustion engine in it. And what that will do is it will use the onboard fuel to constantly run an idling engine, which will keep the pressure inside the tanks and will also generate power for the rocket stage. And that means that it can basically run, as long as it gets refueled every once in a while, it can run pretty much indefinitely. And it can just tow things back and forth between different orbits, which could become very useful in the future. Very cool technology. And I give them huge props for actually trying to innovate. So hopefully we actually see that. They do also have a plan for reuse that I think is somewhat ridiculous, that they call smart reuse, which I think is a total oxymoron. Anyway, their plan is that they're going to drop just that back engine part of the rocket, just the engines, off the rocket, and then catch it in midair after it has deployed a parachute with a helicopter. That seems really risky to me, but...
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure, why not? I guess if you want. Okay.
So we're going to get on to what I don't really consider a competitor, but something that needs to be included in this discussion. The SLS.
The SLS is a colossal waste of NASA's time, energy, and money. It is a political piece of shit that should never have been continued. It is virtually completely useless at this point. It has no freaking purpose. It's outclassed at almost every single step of the way by anything that just about any other company does. It shouldn't exist anymore, but it's a political thing. People want to say, oh, we've got all these jobs in our constituencies, and they basically are a bunch of fucking senators are just fucking old goddamn fucking dinosaurs that need to grow up.
So,
it's a piece of shit. And it shouldn't be wasting NASA's money. NASA should not be wasting money trying to develop another rocket when there's something like SpaceX who can do rockets better, faster, and cheaper. NASA should be focused on Earth exploration and outer space exploration.
Yeah.
Like
planetary
sciences, not rocket launches. It's not what they do anymore.
I really think that their core competencies are and should continue to be Earth observation and science, planetary science, and astronaut training. Yeah. They're very, very good at that. And no one else really is. So, so why did this happen? And is it NASA's? Well, first of all, why did it happen? It happened because the U.S. government, and by this I mean a U.S. government that at the time was controlled by a Republican Congress and a Republican House, were very uncomfortable with the fact that there was nothing to replace. First of all the jobs that were lost when the shuttle program ended.
It was in a different era when they didn't like the idea of only sending people up on Russian rockets, and they wanted to not be completely owned by Russia.
That too. So they decided, you know what, we're going to save money. We're going to take the old main fuel tank from the shuttle, and we'll make it a rocket, and we'll just stick on some old shuttle engines, right? Yeah, right. That's what they did. That's what that rocket is. It is the old shuttle fuel tank with 2 shuttle engines at the bottom of it. Or sorry, I think it's 4. 4, my bad. And a couple solid rocket boosters on the side. Now, how hard can that be, right? Well, human rating a rocket, because this rocket is only really designed to carry people, is very difficult. And one of the biggest problems for Boeing, which is the main contractor on this, is that, first of all, they had 1 billion subcontractors, and the work for this rocket is spread across all 50 states. Oh,
it's stupid. It is just complete. It's what you'd call a boondoggle. It's just a complete colossal waste of time, money, and effort. It exists solely because a bunch of old fat fuckers want to score political points with their constituencies because they have no goddamn balls to stand up and make smart decisions, like saying, no, maybe we should, build this in 1 or 2 states instead of all 50. Yeah, that's really fucking efficient, you fucking morons.
So, you've mentioned repeatedly it is very expensive, and it is very expensive. How expensive is it? Well, just the rocket, not Orion, is costing about $2 billion a year to develop. It has been in development for 8 years. Orion costs another $1.5 billion a year to develop. It is the spacecraft part of it. Much more, honestly, I'm not very hard on Orion because spacecraft are really hard and Orion can do a lot of things. It's pretty cool.
Just launch it on something else.
Exactly. Now, one of the problems here, though, was simply actually Gwynne Shotwell. Gwynne Shotwell, who is amazing. We said her name repeatedly tonight. She said one of the things, and this was I guarantee you this is a veiled shot at SLS. She said when we created a rocket, so Falcon 9. One of the biggest assets we had was that we were able to launch or design the rocket from a blank sheet of paper. They could design the rocket using all the best ideas anybody had ever had in the entire launch industry. They put them all together into one vehicle. The problem that NASA and Boeing had was that this rocket was really designed by the U.S. Senate. They said, we're going to use all these old rocket parts we had, and we're going to make this rocket that is out of all these old pieces.
Because that's less expensive, right? That's like trying to make a gaming computer now out of a bunch of computer parts from the 1980s. It's fucking stupid.
Yeah, it's not a great way to do it, and it really hamstrings your engineers on what they can build. It really has to be, you kind of shoehorn them into this design, and it's not great. Regardless, why is this even on this list? Well, the reason I put it on this list is because SpaceX is not competing against this rocket, but it may, I'm saying may, because it will have to be politically expedient, it may replace it with BFR. BFR will very likely be more capable than SLS will be.
Cheaper.
And a single flight on BFR is probably going to cost somewhere between $50 and $100 million. And SLS is projected to cost $1 billion per flight. Yeah, I didn't make a mistake there. $1 billion. Anyway, so we're going to move on from SLS.
As should the entire United States.
Indeed.
Move on. It's not that into you.
So we're going to move on from SLS to some crazier ideas to get off the ground. Well, this is a persistent one that's been around for a while, and it's called the space elevator. Now, how the hell do you make a space elevator? Well, you put a thing on the ground, like a station on the ground. You put a counterweight beyond geostationary orbit, and then you put a station in geostationary orbit. You can send a climber up and down a cable to and from the ground to the station. Why haven't we done this?
Nothing's strong enough to make the cable.
Exactly. The cable has to be 36, actually more than that, like 40, 50,000 kilometers long, and it has to be one piece, first of all. Second of all...
I mean, that itself is no problem. That's easy.
Secondly, no, unfortunately, we do not currently have a material that is strong enough to make one. It's probably not beyond material science, but we're not there yet.
It'll probably happen someday, probably
It
not
may
in
or
our
may not.
lifetimes.
It may or may not ever happen on Earth. It really depends if we come up with a better idea in the interim. However, the reason I mention it is a legitimate way to get up and down from the moon or Mars. So we might see it used there. For example, on the moon, they could create a space elevator that went from the surface of the moon up into moon's orbit, using materials even like Kevlar that we have in, wide abundance now.
I also feel like on the moon or Mars, it would be a lot safer. I always worry about if they had one and it was ever sabotaged, the damage that cable falling to Earth.
Oh boy. Yeah, it would be enormous.
I don't think you could put it and like there's no safe place you could put it on Earth that it wouldn't kill
a lot of people.
A lot.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So then we have some other silly ideas that have been posited in the past. Not this specific railgun, but railguns have been posited in the past. This basically uses magnetism to massively speed up a magnetic or
metal object,
a ferrous projectile. Biggest problem with this to get to orbit, because yes, you theoretically could get to orbit using a railgun, is simply that first of all, it would be an enormous amount of energy, and second of all, it would melt or destroy any payload you tried to put on it.
A little bit of an issue.
So not a great idea. So our last one is a catapult. So you might go, well, freaking catapult? How the hell do you use a catapult to get to orbit? Well, it's not really like this catapult that our poor little coyote is using here. The catapult they're talking about using is a company called Spin Launch that basically wants to do something like you see with
Slingshot.
Help me out here. No, not Slingshot. Olympic sport, shot put.
Shot put. Same thing as a sling. No.
So basically, their idea is to get a mass going very, very quickly, around and around and around and around and around and around, faster and faster and faster till it's basically up to the almost the speed it needs to be to get to orbit, and then it gets released and flung up. And it looks like they're probably going to have a small rocket stage on it to push it to orbit. But they think they can do that. So why won't this happen probably? Well, first of all, this actually seems more realistic than the railgun. There actually is a company doing this. They have got some funding. And their name is Spin Launch. But a lot of people are very skeptical that they can have a payload actually survive that kind of force.
G-forces
that you'd put on it. It's an enormous amount of force you'd have to put on your payload in order to have it survive the ride to orbit. It should also be noted that people think, rocket flights are pretty nasty environments, and they kind of are. But most of that is vibration. When a rocket launches, you'll actually notice, especially really big rockets, they don't leave the pad very quickly. The acceleration in those rockets is not very high. So the amount of forces on the vehicle are not really crazy or anything. Whereas you get into some of these other alternate technologies and you get ridiculous forces acting on your whatever you want to put into orbit. But yeah, so that is our summary basically of SpaceX's future, what they want to do, and a few other ways to get to orbit and what some of their competitors are doing. So I think we should maybe take a couple questions and then
if anyone has any questions, do ask them. Keep in mind, you can ask us questions the entire way through this if you so choose. We will answer them pretty much whenever. But in case no one has any questions, I do want to say to join us 2 weeks from now when we will be doing another episode of this at the same time. The next episode is basically we got off. Now what? So we're gonna start.
The innuendo is strong.
The innuendo is strong with this one. I don't care. But the next episode of this, we're going to be talking a bit more about Okay, so we're off planet Earth. We've got the ISS. People are living there right now in space, which is friggin' cool when you think about it.
I would just like to. We're going to talk about this next week, but I just want to mention that people have been in space now for over 15 years straight.
Yeah.
Without a break.
Yeah. It's phenomenal. Yeah. But we're going to talk about, the ISS and some of the challenges of just living in space. And then we're going to start into, lunar bases and Mars bases and stuff like that. And once I actually think that once we're done this how to live in space, we're going to be ready for another topic.
Yeah. And we're probably going to get less into like these huge topics. I would really like to drill down onto specific science missions, specific topics later on. So give me anything you want to hear about. Maybe there's a space mission you've heard about, you want to know more about it. Anything like that, please feel free to submit some topic ideas, and
keep in mind we'll do this for space or general science or even tech.
Yep.
Yeah.
We've only covered space so far, but yeah, we're happy to cover tech and science as well.
Yep.
All right, it doesn't look like we have any questions, so shall we sign off for the evening?
I think we shall. I also, first off, thanks everyone for hanging out. It was great fun. For those of you that like Star Citizen, join us Saturday for the Relay Station. I believe this week we're going to have Paul from the Astropub, so that should be good.
Awesome.
Yeah. Also, hey, we kept it to only an hour and a half this time.
We're getting better. We're eventually going to get it down to that 60 minutes we were supposed to be at. But thank you very much for hanging out with us. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks. And
also, David.
Yeah.
Say bye to Mount Sharp.
I will.
Bye.
Bye, Mount Sharp. See you later, everyone.
Bye.